Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the post-lunch event, clearly the most important event of the conference because it's about the economy, and I think you'll agree with that. My name is Adel, HAMAIZIA. Welcome to this afternoon's session, Out of Dependency, Coping with Economic Diversification in Rentier States. One could argue using that term in the title is offensive. I describe it as provocative. We have a fantastic lineup today, but prior to a mini intro, I'd like to start by, as per this morning of the geopolitical risks, we'll be referring to your app once again, so please do refer to your Samsungs, Apples, Huawei's to look up to the screen, and we will have the business risks of 2020. So in order, you must pick in ascending order. So we have unmanageable inflation, question mark, illicit trafficking, brain drain and lack of skilled labor force, of course human capital related, fiscal crises, tariffs and sanctions, and energy price shocks, and finally failure of economic reform agendas. So moving forward with the theme of provocation, I'm a British Algerian, it's in my blood. I must start by saying, when I think about MENA, I think within an unfortunate or fortunate framework of a hostage crisis. I'm not talking about Iran in '79, I'm talking about being hostage to either conflict, structural adjustment programs, some countries know about that, and of course oil price volatility. So when thinking about oil price volatility, we are hostage to something which is that we no longer, of course, have the same influence over, despite the meeting yesterday in Vienna, despite the incredible valuation yesterday on the Aramco IPO at $25.7 billion. We have, like I say, a lineup today, country-specific, theme-specific. Now, when thinking about weaning ourselves of oil, typically you'd think about an increase in non-oil GDP or a decrease in non-oil GDP as being a positive. But of course, non-oil GDP is not independent of oil prices. And furthermore, rather than looking at these sorts of metrics, I think it makes more sense to look at exports, the export percentages vis-a-vis hydrocarbons, and of course the percentage of government revenues. And this speaks to something very important in our region: social contract. This implicit bargain, this written contract that binds population, governed citizens, and of course we're seeing things unwind from Beirut to Baghdad to Aljazair and so on and so forth. So when thinking about this rewriting, this reconfiguration of the social contract, one really has to think about the big word, jobs, 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 and unemployment. In order to service, in order to address, in order to remedy, one really has to think about developing new sectors beyond rentier states that are not labor-dependent, labor-intensive, but rather capital-intensive. With no further ado, and we'll come back to many questions around Vision 2030 to Vision 2021, energy diversification, labor policy, and really the big question, have we missed the industrialization boat? What are the pitfalls of policymaking vis-a-vis industrialization, right? There will also be something slightly different in this session. We will be engaging you, the audience, with questions. So do think about that. We're going to be very precise with time. With no further ado, I'd like to start by introducing my colleague from Saudi Arabia. Of course, Vision 2030 has become a synonym of hope and aspiration in the region. It's been the most observed, critiqued, and assessed document, neoliberal blueprint, de-rentierizing project, model initiative document for the last few years, launched in 2016. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce Ibrahim Saleh Al-SUWAIL, who's Deputy Governor of the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority. And my colleague has 6 to 8 minutes to take us through the latest developments in Saudi, the largest economy in the region. Tfadal.
Thank you, Adel. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon. And actually, it's nice to meet you and speak today about the Saudi Arabia Vision 2030. But before that, let me just touch on the diversification of from a sustainable development perspective. It actually seeks to ensure the long-term stability of the economy by enhancing the economy's ability to adapt and cope with the depletion of basic natural resources and economic volatility, especially in the context of growing competition generated by globalization. By that, there are the importance, why it is important, There are several aspects for that. The development of multiple economic sectors. Second, providing a protection for the economies in emergencies. Third, increasing the national income through boosting foreign investment role in the economy. Last, by growing the economy activity through increasing the private sector role. And to do that, actually, we have put there are actually several indicators to measure the economic diversification. One, by the raising of private sector efficiency and contribution to the country's GDP. Second, by the increasing and diversified of export structure. And finally, by the improvement and aggregate in the employment. For that, there are actually four major focuses for the economic diversification. One, which is the macroeconomic policies as a prerequisite for economic. From improving the liquidity management to developing a strong regulatory and supervisory and prudential framework and strengthening the financial sector. Second, comes the regulatory and the institutional framework for conducting the private sector growth. And this comes by simplifying the government bureaucracy, reducing the regulatory and barriers to competition, adjust the competition policy laws, and monitor their implementation. Also, third, from the promotion of the increased trade integration within the region. The third pillar is the public sector and what it does as a catalyst for the private sector growth. This is driven by the reduce of the size of the public workforce by improving the wages in the private sector of qualified employees. Second, improve the quality of education and including towards the skills needed in the private sector. The last part is marching toward a more diversified economy, and this is mainly driven by three main pillars. One, improving the climate for the foreign direct investment, including the non-oil industry by reducing the accreditation terms, creation of investment, promotion intermediaries, and simplification of structure. Second, the promotion of and deepening integration of global value chains by enhancing production efficiencies, enhance managerial quality, and improve technological capacity to ensure the wages. Last is actually the promotion of vertical diversification in existing sectors by focusing on transition and also opening a new sector to the market. Now, Saudi Arabia has actually introduced the Vision 2030 and the economic diversification. The high-level dependencies on oil led Saudi policymakers to develop a detailed program to diversify the economy of the kingdom designed by Vision 2030. There are several investment sectors have been opened, such as energy and water, transportation and logistics, industrial manufacturing, mining, metals, emerging sectors such as education, innovation, entrepreneurship, real estate, ICT, petrochemical, health, tourism, and quality of life. All of these sectors have been are the focus for the economic diversification in the country. And just talking about one or two of them, tourism as an example has been, we are actually proud of opening up the visas last September. People actually are granted visas. There are several sectors, nationalities granted visas on arrival. This opens the kingdom actually for more people to come and visit Saudi Arabia. This tells a lot about the importance of actually having people visiting the country, whether it's for tourism or actually for conducting business. The other part is the entrepreneurship, and there is a low contribution of entrepreneurship in the economic growth compared to oil production and tourism. This weak influence led policymakers also to seek solutions to strengthen this sector. The Saudi Arabia vision advocates an optimal balance between the current oil-based and the knowledge-based economy characterized by the innovation and entrepreneurship, excellence in education, and efficiency delivered by the public sector. To do that, actually, we aim to develop and diversify the economy in several aspects. First, objective of facilitating the business practice, mainly organization aspects. These objectives, initiatives are the Unified Information Center, development of a work system through the organization of data as inputs to economic diversification decision. Second, the National Competitiveness Center, which is the environmental investment reform that enable the diversification of investment. And as of that, as per the World Bank Doing Business report, Saudi Arabia has been ranked this year as the #1 top reformer in the world in the Doing Business report, giving us actually, jumping us from 92 to 62. And this also explains how Saudi Arabia is actually delivering a lot on the business environment, making it simple, easy for investments and investors, whether it is local or foreigners come and open businesses set up in the kingdom. The second part is actually objective of attracting foreign direct investment. There are several initiatives for this. #1 is the Invest Saudi as the marketing the kingdom of Saudi Arabia as an investment destination and providing comprehensive information. This brand is now official to use as the single brand to invest in Saudi Arabia across all ministries, development and authorities. Second is developing the investment opportunities and the attracting foreign investment from a quality, sustainable and diversified economy. Third is the mega and strategic projects program, which is like the Red Sea project and the Qiddiya and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Before we go to our next speaker, and thank you for taking us through sort of the latest developments in Saudi, I'd like to ask, has anybody heard of Hulk Hogan? Who? With show of hands, please. So would you believe me if I told you that I was in Saudi Arabia 3-4 weeks ago and I actually saw Hulk Hogan at a WWE World Wrestling event? I never thought I would say that in all my times looking at the economics of the region, but indeed Hulk Hogan was indeed wrestling in Riyadh. So there are really tectonic shifts for all of the pros and cons and the challenges that we can put forward to Saudi. I arrived in the airport a few weeks ago, and it literally took me 5 minutes to get through. I'm not sure if it was the conference that I was attending or it was an independent factor, but it is quite stunning. On the point of Saudi now moving to Bahrain, and of course we look forward to the football match on Sunday. I don't know who you think is going to win. Anyway, so we go over the King Fahd Causeway to Sheikha Hind Al Khalifa, President of the Bahrain International Federation of Business and Professional Women. And moving from one of the largest economies in the region, we move to its younger brother next door, perhaps, in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Sheikha Hind will take us through developments in Bahrain and the role of women in economic transformation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Actually, challenges bring awareness. And since the 60s, more than 50 years ago, Bahrain has taken steps towards diversification. Banking has grown stronger. The banking sector is highly recognized for its regulatory framework under the Central Bank of Bahrain. In order to keep up with the impact of new technologies on the sector, regulations have been updated at a quick pace. According to the CBB, there were a total of 398 financial institutions in the country as of September 2017. And the sector contributes 17.2% to the GDP. In addition, Bahraini nationals comprise 65% of employees in the financial sector. Since December 2016, Bahrain has home to Islamic financial institutions, considered to be the highest in the Middle East, according to the ICD Thomson Reuters Islamic Finance Development Indicator, ranking second globally only to Malaysia. Today, the country's National Vision 2030 aims to enhance private sector growth, and government continues investment in infrastructure. Michael Stantz, a Nobel Prize winner economist, said structural flexibility is correlated to a strong global economy growth. It's necessary that governments and business invest in education, infrastructure, knowledge base, and technology-based economy. Certainly, the approach creates jobs and work opportunities. Therefore, investment in youth and education are the focus of the Economic Vision 2030. Awareness is the drive of the growth of an ecosystem in Bahrain. It's a community initiative that brings together all pillars of the ecosystem: entrepreneurs, corporates, investors, incubators, education institutions, and the government of Bahrain, all together promoting the culture of an ecosystem. The startups and incubators are receiving more exposure than ever. The role of entrepreneurs in economic growth is rapid and is supported by Tamkeen. FinTech is going to reach 100 companies in Bahrain, and this is providing growth already. We've witnessed that. The platform is creating opportunity for innovation and creativity. As you must all have heard of Amazon, it's a scale of a data center, and it's filling the niche in the geographical area. Well, Bahrain is celebrating a 100-year anniversary of education, and literacy rate in Bahrain is second highest in the Arab world at 94%. In line with Bahrain Vision 2030, the government launched the Quality Assurance Authority of Education and Training to develop and implement standards of institutions. Well, my colleague from Saudi Arabia has not touched on women's role, so I will touch it, and it applies very much also on a neighboring country in the Gulf. Women play a significant role in the development of Bahrain at all levels. Awareness of women's rights and potential allowed for women participation in workforce. The Supreme Council of Women, under the leadership of Her Royal Highness Princess Sabika bint Ibrahim Al Khalifa, have significantly contributed to women participation and family stability. Well, women are involved in many sectors. Education in particular, there are new schools in Bahrain. As much as I can remember, girls' schools in Bahrain started only 9 years after the boys' school have started. And I must say that in empowering women in Bahrain, the Chamber of Commerce has celebrated its 80th anniversary, knowing that the political empowerment only happened in 2002. So they have always had the right to assume and work in the commerce and have their right to vote for the Chamber of Commerce and be elected as well. I hope I have given you a glimpse on Bahrain's situation, and I leave the floor to others to speak.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Hind. We now transition from country-specific focuses to more of a macro picture with Dr. Alia MOUBAYED, Managing Director of Jefferies, who'll also take us through the balance sheet on diversification so far. Seeing her from the banking, we need a P&L. And we'd also like you to tell us, what do we need more of, Alia? Please, you have a few minutes.
Thank you, Adel, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think where I sit in financial markets, and obviously I look at where the region as a whole is evolving, both in terms of policies, but also in terms of policy outcomes, and try to benchmark it to other emerging markets. And I think I would like to focus on three issues very briefly. The first one is go back and remind ourselves of why this region needs to reform so badly. I mean, why is it that we have such the imperative for reform? And then the second thing I would like to talk talk about is to ask ourselves, looking a little bit at numbers, how well did we fare or not, given that we've heard that in many countries a lot of policy initiatives have been undertaken, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years. And then say, where do we need to go or do more? So on the first one, I think it is obviously clear. In my mind, there are 3 important reasons why the Middle East oil exporters in particular, and us, I am Lebanese, sitting in even countries that are oil importing and where there is an important spillovers of what happens in oil exporting countries to our own economy, of why we see this imperative to be important. There are obviously 3 reasons. The first one is, and today we are all waiting, maybe the decision on the OPEC meeting has come out or not, I'm not sure. But what is happening in the oil and gas market, the structural transformations that are that have put us into this new normal in the oil and gas market is a key imperative for structural reform and transformation since the advent of shale, obviously, and the kind of ceiling by which efforts at cutting further output in order to prop up prices is not really working all the time and leading to the higher oil prices that many of the countries in the region would want to see, and particularly a leader like in the market like Saudi Arabia. So what's happening in the oil market is now a constraint, and maybe in terms of policy, and maybe an opportunity for reform. The second imperative is obviously relates to the need for job creation. We've heard that all the efforts now about the policies is here to tackle the demographic challenges that particularly countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, and Algeria face. The IMF, I think, has done several estimations along with the World Bank, and every year we're looking at least at around 1 million new entrant into the labor market in oil exporting countries only. And these jobs need to be secured and need to be secured in sectors that provide sustainable kind of livelihood. So the job creation imperative is very important. And the third, even though we think it's not very imminent, but the climate, obviously the climate change imperative and the constraint it is putting increasingly more in financial markets where I sit as investors, whether bondholders or equity investors, are increasingly tying their investment portfolio management policies to environmental sustainability goals. And of course, that means a lot to countries in the region, which need to think in terms of the risk of ending up with stranded assets and the need to adjust policies to avoid this. So these are the imperative of reform. But when I look at the balance sheet, obviously, we see that there has been this policy response. We've heard about Saudi Arabia, what the Bahrain vision is all about. The UNE and Bahrain has advanced. So tightening budgets, making socially, reforming the subsidies. We have seen a lot of this over the last 3 years, trying to take measures in the labor market. But we have seen also from the macro perspective, an increasing result through external borrowing to plug the continued large gap that the country is facing. And just to remind you, actually, I mean, the region, compared to the period of the pre-oil shock versus so pre-2015 to post-2015, I mean, the fiscal surpluses of the region have gone from 5.7% on average to deficits of 5.2% of the total GDP. Government debt has increased from 25% of GDP to 32%. External debt alone has gone from 27 to 41% in 5 years. And the current account surpluses that we used to have around 12% of GDP are now only about 1%. So the countries that used to accumulate around $200 billion of surpluses every year are now barely accumulating $35 billion. So this is a major, basically, shock to the balance sheet. I have not talked about what's happening on the balance sheet of banks side, but this is MENA oil exporters according to the IMF. On the growth side, and I think this is where the picture looks a bit bleak, to tell you the truth, is that we have moved from an average growth of around 4.7 to 5% growth to only 1.7 to 2% growth in the last 5 years. And this is where the problem is, and this is where the kind of reforms that we've heard about, moving towards giving more fiscal space to the private sector, have become even more important. Now, if this is a challenged balance sheet, I think also we have seen positive signals, because we all know that basically transforming our exports is not easy. But again, I'm a geek, I look at numbers, and if you look at some of the numbers that the IMF has started to release about the diversification of exports in the region, we see some little small transformation on the goods side, but mostly on the export of services side that has increased tremendously between 2000 for the last 20 years, and more so since 2014, with services related to trade logistics, to advisory services, to tourism, increasingly providing more and more sources of livelihood. Even in terms of what our colleague from Saudi Arabia has said in terms of plugging into global value change, countries like Algeria, maybe Morocco, even though it's not but I think also Saudi is trying to go in that direction. We have seen important improvements, even though small, and these need to be continued. And very briefly, I mean, as we look into the future, I think there are 3 areas where we need to continue to focus. Again, as a macroeconomist, we need to continue our efforts in terms of macroeconomic stability and reforms, particularly focusing on public finance, reducing deficits, but increasingly, as we do successfully that, think about how we can transition into more competitive exchange rate-based monetary policies. And I think that is what will gain us more in terms of the competitiveness that we need. Right. A second related, of course, is to continue to invest wisely the assets and the assets under management in our sovereign wealth funds. And third, of course, is to continue on the structural reform agenda, from competition to labor force participation, women labor force participation, because that will be the segue to increasing the space for private sector growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alia. And I hope we can come back to the point on the role of sovereign wealth funds. I was actually speaking with Professor SPRINGBORG earlier, and we were thinking about, if you're a smaller Gulf state, for example, returns are really the incentive, the motivation. But if you're a larger player, then of course you have the dual role of having to try and foster infant industries or whatever it may be. We've heard about defense, renewables, and tourism. It'd also be good to come back later, Alia, on, you referred to debt, yeah. But for some of these countries, this was an intention. You know,
of course.
For some of them, it was a target, 25, 30%. So it'd be great to come back to that. Yeah. We now move to Dr. Karen Young of the American Enterprise Institute, who will take us through specialization and the downstream and labor market policy, a central issue. And just for those that may not be as familiar with the Gulf states, maybe if you could just unpack what labor markets look like as well in terms of segmentation and the national, non-national conundrum. And of course, if you could say a little bit about consumer markets. Karen, please.
Thank you so much, Adel. It's really good to be here. You know, it used to be those of us who look from the outside at the rentier economies of the Gulf and the GCC economies that nothing ever changed and that the model was pretty static. And I think if we're talking about positive changes in development for the region, one of the changes is that economic policy is really at the center of state capacity right now. Absolutely. There is variation, there is competition, there are new ideas, there's policy innovation happening. And that can only be a good thing because it drives home the issue to citizens that policy choices matter. And so I think we have to really underline that as one of the silver linings of the changes really since 2011. And we can see the 2011 period is incubating and encouraging a lot of activist and interventionist foreign policy in the region emanating from the GCC. But since late 2014, the shift has been in more innovative economic policy. The outcome of this competitive range of policies, I think we can see in a number of spaces. So labor markets in particular. We're seeing a range of reactions to nationalization policies across the GCC, encouraging nationals and forcing out foreigners. And so that friendliness to the foreigner is really varied depending on the demographics of each state. And again, this is where difference becomes really important. And for the smaller Gulf states and those that are wealthier, we're talking about the Qatar, UAE kind of Kuwait paradigm, there is difference, but there has also been a bit more competition in terms of inviting those with specialized skills. So the golden visa phenomena, which is going across the GCC right now, which Saudi Arabia actually also has announced just in the last couple of days. But the idea in the UAE then is to attract people who can be high-skilled workers in science and technology, even within arts and culture. And you don't see that in other places where there is more demand for job creation for nationals. In Oman, we've seen the restriction of 96 different sectors for employment of nationals only. In terms of restriction and ability of workers to move between jobs, which has been really important in kind of unwinding the Kafala system, Bahrain, I think, has done the most interesting and advanced work here in creating the... What is the Kafala system? The idea that you are legally bound to your employer as a foreigner and don't have the ability to change employers without the permission of your sponsor, your visa sponsor. So your right to live in the country tied to your employment contract, which has, of course, been debilitating for any kind of organization around workers' rights. And really, bad for the market. You don't get the best skilled people for the job. You get the people who are willing to stay. So it's kind of a perverse incentive structure. But Bahrain has done a lot to kind of dismantle this, to allow people to change employers. And I think this is really the way forward, is that if we have more free movement within the labor market, you'll get people who are better at their jobs and more committed to staying longer and being consumers in society as well. And I'm going to get to that and the importance of driving domestic demand in the GCC economies and external demand for hydrocarbon products. We also see a competitive space in debt issuance. Alia mentioned this, and we've even seen like dueling bond issues from Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the last couple of years. So the accessibility to international debt capital markets has been really important. The money is there, investors are willing, and some countries are in higher debt to GDP ratios than other. Very big variation here between Oman, Bahrain versus Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. And sometimes countries are going to debt markets simply because they can, right? And it becomes a cushion for some and a necessity for others. In the subsidy and tax space, the alternative sources of fiscal revenue, this is also a really interesting space where finally we're seeing the cutback on electricity subsidies, on water, and the implementation of a 5% value-added tax in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Of course, that was meant to be across the 6 GCC states and has been rather slow to be broadly accepted. One interesting thing, I think, that I would emphasize and why governance matters and the structure of governance matters, where we see policy innovation and what I would call actually policy incubation or acceleration, I think actually the federal structure of the UAE has been very beneficial in that an emirate like Dubai, which does not have oil wealth, can play a role as a place where new policy ideas can be tried out. Dubai was one of the first to implement a tax on a road toll. The SALIC system in Dubai was several years ago. Now it's been adopted in Abu Dhabi. Why does that matter? Because if you have a place where ideas can be kind of in a sandbox to play about, see how citizens respond to them, see how expatriates respond to them, and then it becomes a test case, not just for the UAE, but for the region as a whole. So this has been a really useful thing in the federal structure of the UAE. I don't know if you noticed, but I did write a little piece in your booklet here, and it's on this topic of economic diversification. And the first line of that piece is that oil is still king. So hydrocarbons, oil and gas still are king in the GCC states. It's still driving non-oil GDP as much as it is oil GDP. And it's what a process I think of as diversification light, in which we see the creation of new markets for hydrocarbon products in a whole value chain, right? It's petrochemicals, it's refineries, it's plastics, it's a whole system of products and the trading of those products, which is the future of wealth generation for oil exporters in the GCC. And that's healthy and good, that's fine. But one of the kind of implications of that shift is that you have to be sure that you're boosting demand at home. And because these are not manufacturing-based economies in the GCC, you need that consumption. And so this is where, in the smaller economies, which are more heavily weighted towards expatriates over citizens, keeping that demand growth for all kinds of products, whether it's hospitality, food and beverage, whether it's people buying things in the mall or the service industry, as Alia mentioned, is really vital. Real estate as well. So the downturn we see in the UAE on the real estate market is a realization that you've got to keep that domestic consumption going. On the external side, it's the creating demand markets for that oil value chain of products. And this is where the nexus of foreign aid, of foreign direct investment going from the Gulf to India, China, Horn of Africa becomes really important, because those markets are where lots of people live, they're young economies, it's where we expect middle class consumer growth to grow. And this is where it gets a little complicated also with issues like climate change. So India is a really important market for the whole world, for all of us to want to see succeed and grow. But this is a place where 800 million people live in rural areas and are not getting the benefit of really sustained economic growth. And how do the Gulf states see that? Well, their future is tied to the future of that middle-class consumer in India and in China as well, and Pakistan and Ethiopia, places like that. So we should care that people don't have access to clean water and that they're inundated with water at other points of the year. We should care that there's not good infrastructure and trade connections coming from ports in the Red Sea corridor. And the Gulf states in particular are now making this a development priority, but see it as their own economic future as well. So I think that's something that, that we have to keep in mind. Finally. In terms of let me just touch briefly on kind of hydrocarbons per citizen and why it matters and why we see such variation within the GCC. So a place like Qatar doesn't have to do a whole lot of this reform because per capita, or per citizen, not even per capita, per citizen, hydrocarbon wealth is about $340,000 per person per year. Right? Compare that to an Oman or Saudi Arabia, where it's closer to $20,000. In the UAE, it's about $90,000 per citizen. Right? So that is going to constrain your policy space in a really dramatic way. And in terms of the kind of public sector wage bill, again, this is where we see tighter conditions. It's about 50% of the fiscal budget in Kuwait, about 50% in Saudi Arabia, much lower in a place like the UAE, about 20-25%. So those are the points of differentiation, which we'll continue to see. But I think the positive end is that states are now more willing to experiment and to make harder choices about policy innovation.
Thank you very much, Karen. You picked up on many interesting points. And in fact, you refer to almost policy labs. And actually one thing that we may come back to when thinking about diversification and these sort of policy islands of excellence, to use that term, is really free zones as well. And maybe that's something that we can come back to, thinking Yanbu, Jubail, Qatar, and Saudi, and from, of course, you refer to Morocco as well. So last but not least, we now move to Professor Robert Springborg from the Naval Postgraduate School. He'll take us through political economy challenges and state capacity vis-a-vis economic diversification. And if I may put him on the spot, because I know he has a wealth of comparative capacity, thinking beyond Chile, Malaysia, Mexico, Indonesia, and some of the big old diversification success stories or case studies, maybe something on Norway, and we haven't heard the word institutions from any of our panelists just yet. Professor Springborg.
Adel, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. And I'm an interloper in various ways, and I'll confess the most important way to you to begin with here. It is that there is a new book coming out on exactly the subject of this panel, edited by a Roman, Giacomo Luciani, and it's the product of the Gulf Research Center's annual conference of 2018, in which some of the best and the brightest address the subject of diversification. And I heartily recommend it. It'll be out in a few months. And so it goes in great detail into the challenges facing the GCC countries to diversify. And I'll give away the bottom line right away. And Karen has already coined a nice term for it, diversification light. In your program here, it talks about specialization in the energy sector, but I think diversification light is a better way to handle it, and it's more consonant with, in fact, what the authors of this edited volume say, and it is that, look it, you know, it is impossible to imagine that you are going to have classical diversification of an industrial sort. This would be a late industrializing subregion of the world, and given the transition required from a rentier to a productive economy, it's well beyond the capacities of any one of them to do it, basically. So let us not think in the classical sort of East Asian model. The second model, which a couple of the panelists have touched upon, is that of diversification into services, but there are limits on that. Those of you who are my age remember when Beirut was the entrepot to the Middle East, and there was exactly one entrepot. It was Beirut, and two things destroyed it. One was the Civil War. The second was the growth of the Gulf. And so the entrepot for the Middle East shifted to Dubai. And in either case, there was only one. So to have a service-based economy of the nature of Beirut circa 1972, or of Dubai at the present time, as the model for an economy such as the size of Saudi Arabia's, is really not on. And the Bahraini model is a financial service model only. And that's probably not big enough to sustain it, and recent financial figures for Bahrain would suggest exactly that. So further diversification would be necessary in this one sort of second example here of Bahrain. But so what the authors of the volume say is, well, let's revisit David Ricardo, that fine Portuguese-English economist of a couple of hundred years ago, and think about then diversification in the area in which the Middle East has an advantage. And the comparative advantage is energy, most obviously. And so, as Karen has said, then it's diversification light. And so that the idea of any vision, 2030, 2040, 2050, needs to be consonant with that basic principle. And they immediately go into how can we then protract the period in which this diversification can occur. And top of the list, interestingly enough, is the environmental constraint. And so they go into how can fossil fuels, the life of fossil fuels, be extended to enable then Saudi and other big exporters to have the time to make the shift into a much more energy-based economy, which is not only fossil fuels, but is also renewables. And so a couple of the vital chapters of this book go into the technology of carbon capture and storage, of the shift into renewables, And I'm happy to report that the bottom line is it's all doable, that we're not about ready to stop using gas and oil, that we have a long generation left that can be extended by effective use, especially of carbon capture and storage. And so you start with the technology of it, and assuming then that this in turn provides diversification. As you're generating these technologies locally, you are employing, after all, Saudi Arabia, and Adel knows better than any because he's just been doing research on this subject, of Saudi Arabia sending its young people abroad for advanced degrees, most especially in areas related to energy. Engineering areas and so on, and who are not being adequately employed either in Saudi or in the comparator, which is Algeria. So you have people, you have human resources that are really not relevant to a broad-scale industrialization effort, but are very relevant to this more tailored diversification within the energy sector. Now, Adel suggested we think about Scandinavia as a model here, Norway. It's not just technical issues, it's not just getting the finances right, it's getting the overall model right. And those of you who've had the pleasure to work with Norwegians, as I have, both in the field and with their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are a bit sort of modern-day missionaries, I must say, about them. And I have some Norwegian blood, so I guess I can insult them and do it without fear of contradiction here. It is that, how did Norway manage to go from a sort of a sleepy cod fishing, pine tree cutting sort of a place into having what is one of the most dynamic oil companies in the world, Statoil, a sovereign wealth fund that's possibly the most profitable, and to have done this with a society that wasn't really ready for it. But their model is, and I'll sum it up all in one word, which is the word they like to use. It's called public brain power. And what is the essence of that term is the conversion of stakeholders in the national economy into decision makers in the national economy. It's the idea that you've had enormous amount of participation in Norway in decisions about the economy of the country and especially about energy. And those of you who follow our Scandinavian brothers up there will know that they are imposing upon state oil now a conversion from fossil fuels into green energy, basically. So this idea of public brain power is hugely important. And so I'm running out of time here, and I just sort of like to end on the note of urging you to pick up Giacomo Luciani's book, which gives you a context for this, but also to look at the comparative model of Norway, which we all laugh about that as being absolutely and utterly irrelevant to the GCC. But personally, I don't think so. I think that it reflects a way of focusing on your strong suit, of using it to bring a population together, of giving meaningful roles to people in your population, and coming out ahead at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Springborg, for that comparative ending, and it actually provides an interesting segue. So when thinking about sometimes we hear these abstract comparative case studies. You think Norway, that's so far away, they're completely different. They had institutions, they're in Europe, they were part of the Hanseatic League and so on and so forth. But the reality is, it's often environment and not individual. Why do I say that? And this is a quiz question for everybody in the crowd. Who set up the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund? And if you guys know, you can't say. Anybody? Anybody? Iraqi. It was an Iraqi who set up the now largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. So it's environment, not individual or ethnicity that drives success, in my humble opinion. But now coming back to colleagues on the stage, while I warm up my colleagues on the stage, please do prepare some interesting questions, not statements, and my reputation as an enforcer sometimes precedes me, so I will stop you. To come back to my colleague from SAGIA, you mentioned the incredible leap from 92 to 62. Leaders, officials, they're obsessed by these numbers. Sometimes the methodology is, are we working towards the methodology or are we working towards the environment? Open book, open question. The bankruptcy law, incredible. NOMU, excellent. What else has the kingdom been doing in order to attract, as part of your mandate, investment into the kingdom? I know about Taysir, for example. If you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and what are investors looking at, which sectors, for example?
Well, thank you, Adel, actually, for this question. You mentioned Taysir. Taysir is a committee headed by His Excellency, the Minister of Commerce, which oversee the development of the business climate, business environment, reporting to SIDA, which is the Council of Economy and Development in the country, led by His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Taysir is organized, or actually there are over 40 representatives from different business government sectors. Some of them have direct or indirect influence or impact to the business climate and business environment. What we do is we gather every week, led by His Excellency the Minister, and focus on several sectors per week. So based on the World Bank ranking, based on the World Economic Forum also pillars, we make sure that we adhere and actually focus, implement, improve, develop each sector, one across border. For instance, previously, a couple of years ago, it used to take the container over 2 weeks to be released in the airport. Now, actually, within 24 hours, in some cases, you can release it while the ship is in the sea did not arrive. So these kind of reforms help. The insolvency law, you just mentioned it. The commercial arbitration center, again, previously we haven't had any commercial, specialized commercial arbitration centers. Now there are over 20 across the country specialized for commercial arbitration centers. The new investment law also, which we are working on, which defines that there is no differences between the local and the foreigner investors. Both of them actually, when they invest, they are actually treated equally. So all of these pillars jump to the conclusion of the improving the business climate and actually cutting a lot of the red tapes for the investors, whether it is for local or foreigners at the same time.
Thank you. And I think protection of minority investors has
Indeed,
been
it's
a
actually,
big one. Equal of New Zealand and Singapore, I read.
Actually, we're proud actually to have been rated #1 again this year.
Yep. So now on to a slightly more challenging question for both Sheikh Ahmed and yourself as people from the region. You come from a region with a unique labor market, nationals, non-nationals. When you talk about developing some of these new industries, renewables, defense, tourism, and this goes for Bahrain as well, do Bahrainis and Saudis want to do these jobs? Do they still think that they're too good for them? Is the reservation wage too low? Comments, please.
Well, I must say Bahrain has always been an open society and coexistence with different cultures, religion, in school. It is a very liberal society in the sense that they accept to work in hotels, and now I've seen girls working in security sector. So tourism is a very new sector, and guide like for tours and museums, it is happening, and I don't feel there is any challenge in that. It is accepted.
So does Saudi have what we describe as a blue-collar labor force, or are we still waiting? Or is it light blue?
Well, it is actually both. We've been actually seeking knowledge transfer, education from abroad. So we do welcome actually companies to come to Saudi Arabia to first have the experience, build the technology. But nevertheless, Saudi Arabia, we've been actually serving the pilgrims who are visiting the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina, since actually the origin of Islam. So we are actually into this business, and the people who are doing this are actually Saudi people. Touching on the females, a lot of actually workforce now is moving towards female. My colleague actually just reminded me of something. Again, in the security workforce, we started actually having female workforce in the government security workforce.
Thank you. An open question for Karen, Alia, and perhaps Bob, if you like. one area or key sector, which is, you referred to, I think, Horn of Africa and Red Sea earlier on, is ports and logistics. And Bob alluded to David Ricardo and used the word comparative advantage. And to add a few more C's to that would be, of course, competitiveness, competition, and coordination and connectivity, in fact, and consumer markets. You're going to add an extra C in for fun. Is trade capacity or trade growth going to meet port capacity? Do we have too much of these? You know, where is this going?
Well, I think it's important to separate kind of national ambitions and firm ambitions. So if we're talking about DP World, for example, I mean, the company is growing, it's expanding, it's doing well. I mean, I think only 30% of their operations are out of Jebel Ali now, so they're really all over the world. Yep. But that's quite separate from foreign policy decisions by the federal government to create ports in Eritrea or, you know, elsewhere. So, you know, there can be synergy there, but there can also sometimes be the political ambition leading before the commercial opportunity. But in a kind of bigger picture sense, there is not good trade integration in MENA. We all know that. There's not good trade integration within the GCC. It has gotten better, and the service industry has expanded, but there's a whole lot of room for more of that to happen, and it's obviously politics which have stood in the way. So, you know, this is where I think, because these will never be, and should not be, I mean, we're skipping kind of a generation of, you know, in terms of development models of the, you know, manufacturing sector. And for women, that's been an excellent thing. Isn't it great that women across the Gulf are getting into the workplace and don't have to bother making sweatshirts, you know, and don't have to bother with that whole pattern of women's mobilization efforts, which have usually been on the factory floor. So thank God for that. But, you know, there are kind of also harder mountains to, you know, to climb in terms of job creation. And so it's nice that tourism is expanding as a sector, but, you know, those aren't the kind of jobs that are really high in productivity. They don't necessarily have a career path towards management or ownership. And, you know, the word ownership is important. The structure of ownership in firms across the region and across the GCC is a problem. And this is why we don't see growth in smaller and medium-sized enterprises. And the state has a lot to do with that, but also the, you know, ownership structure of kind of elite groups.
Absolutely. I think it takes us back to actually that point. It takes us back to the title of Rentier State. Is it a mentality? Is it a rent-seeking private sector? We always joke around with colleagues when we ask, how private is this private sector really? And that's a question that we continue on. Alia, along with that point, do you mind also touching upon something which you had alluded to but hadn't consulted fully within the 8 minutes, of course, and that is the role of the sovereign wealth funds and PIF. Are they crowding out the private sector? Is it a necessity in the short term to own everything from SABIC to whatever else? Alia.
Sure, just a couple of things. I mean, just on the issue of ports, I think it's very important to remind again ourselves that basically the region, and particularly the Gulf countries, are trying to reposition themselves in the new geostrategic landscape and the geoeconomic landscape, where more and more of the economic power in the world is shifting eastwards. And I think when we are to basically assess the feasibility of projects like some of the ports being where DP World is investing, or one has to look really at where trade growth and investment flows and movement of labor is likely to be in the next 40 to 50 years. And that is really the whole corridor from Asia into Africa. And this is where of course, much of the visions of many of the countries in the Gulf is based on the need to play a role in them, not least, of course, China's Belt and Road initiative, but more important, more than but expanded even more into the Indo-Pacific vision of that the Japanese government is working on with India. So there is this larger landscape that I think justifies a lot of infrastructure investment. But I do realize that we have always to think in terms of the scale of these projects and whether we are not over-investing in that. So that's one point. On the issue of the PIF and whether sovereign wealth fund, actually, and I'm sure Karen has done a lot of research and is much more knowledgeable than me, I just think that many of these sovereign wealth funds are still investing abroad rather than domestically, and for that matter, sort of the type of crowding out that you're talking about is not actually happening. Now obviously, the policy statements most recently, and particularly after the Saudi Aramco IPO, has been that much of this investments will be channeled towards the domestic economy. And I think this is where, again, looking at the numbers, you can imagine that, well, $25 to $30 billion can be relatively absorbed when an economy every year is basically, the deficit is around $50 to $60 billion in a country like Saudi Arabia. Or when you think that in Oman, I mean, job creation requires more investments in the Duqm port to develop it as a logistical hub. So I think there could be a role for sovereign wealth fund in driving some of the growth, investment-led growth models. Now, obviously, you could argue whether this is a right or wrong thing. I mean, models of state capitalism in China or in other parts of the world has their advantages or disadvantages. And I still do believe that the region, we have to strike the right balance. I think there is a much bigger role for the private sector that we have not yet tapped in terms of potential. And I would prefer, given also the investment that many of these countries are doing in the education and in the human capital, that we actually leave more the space for the private sector rather than continue to focus on a sort of state capitalist kind of growth model.
Thank you very much. And I think you almost read my mind. I was actually going to move to Robert to ask, when thinking about tech leapfrogging and the like, and that's something which is a necessity for economic diversification, whether it be from Mexico to Malaysia, for a country like Saudi or maybe Algeria over the hill, how does one capture and how does one leapfrog? Is there a magic formula? You know, is it international branch campuses? Is it sending students abroad? What do these governments need to do? You know, where are they going? Is it content of the curriculum or color scheme of the campus that we need to think about?
Well, there are two issues. Quality of education. I mean, the access to education in the Arab world is improved more dramatically than any other part of the world. So the Arabs are now educating themselves at a level in terms of access to education that is globally competitive. What hasn't kept pace is the quality of education, and it's fallen way, way behind comparators on the basis of GDP per capita. So what do you do about this? And various remedies have been tried. Sending students abroad is one of them. Importing universities is another. Computerization of education. But last but by no means least, as Ali has just mentioned, privatization. And there is a global privatization of education occurring, and the Arab world is partaking of that. And one of the now largest providers of private educational services in the Middle East is a Emirati-based company, GEMS Education. It has something like 180 schools. And so innovation is occurring with this. So that's one side of the story. It's how to improve quality of education. But the second part, and the more difficult part of the story, is the incentive to learn. And the incentive to learn is a job. It used to be a civil service job. That incentive is now gone for the vast majority of students of secondary and university levels. So what about the private sector? And that's why the integrated model is really important. It's not enough to educate without employing. And the Middle East as a whole has the lowest proportion of women in the labor force of any region in the world. Less than 25% of women work in the Middle East. In every Arab country, women are now young women are better educated than young men. So you are losing this huge proportion of talented people because there is insufficient employment opportunity. So it's not enough just to try to fix education. You've got to fix employment, and that means the private sector. And so everything we've been talking about here is absolutely essential if you're going to give youth hope and the incentive to perform well and learn, and then propel the economy forward. So those two things are intimately linked.
Thank you very much. I think moving beyond credentialism, one of the challenges nationals in the Gulf and also from North Africa and the Mashraq graduate with this piece of paper, doctor, masters, but of course it's the labor market skills mismatch which continues to dictate. So, and not only thinking about today, but actually tomorrow, so the future of work, susceptibility around automation, these are big challenges that we really need to think about. What I'd like to do now in our remaining time, we have around 13 minutes, I believe. We'd like to come to you, the audience, and name affiliation, short question, not statement. And if you do, I shall cut you off. The lady with her hand up on my far left, please. Name, affiliation, and question, please.
I don't know what affiliation means, but anyway, my name is Haifa Al-Khaifi, and I work for Petroleum Development Oman, from Oman. I have a question, not statement, for Professor Robert. You mentioned about Statoil and how it has successfully transformed into a fully fledged energy company. In fact, I think they've even changed their name to Equinor. You also made reference to countries like Singapore that may not have indigenous resources, but have successfully transformed their economies based on human capital. I referred to the panelists who talked about diversification of their economies from the GCC states. There's Vision 2030, away from an emphasis on oil and gas into renewables and other sectors. However, Sister Alia also mentioned about deficits in the double digits in some instances. Do you think in the GCC that we are transforming fast enough in order to diversify our economies and also address the issue of deficits simultaneously? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I see another hand? Very shy crowd. Any economists in the room? Please. You're nominated to ask a question, please.
I speak in French.
Okay, please, your microphone's coming around.
Thank you. Vous avez parlé de la fuite des...
You talked about the fact that many members of the elite choose to go abroad. This is an important aspect in my country, Algeria. In Algeria, we've invested significantly in education. Irrespective of the actual level of universities, there is nonetheless a significant number of people who are trained, educated, and very literate. We also have a considerable number of students who've studied at universities abroad, but we also have an economic problem. It's not just a matter of absorbing these skilled people, but it's also a case of seeing whether or not the young people concerned have decision-making opportunities.
Les émigrés et prennent les catégories les plus qualifiées dans nos pays. Il y a donc ici comme un deal entre nos dirigeants qui se débarrassent des élites et entre les puissances qui les prennent. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. We'll take one more if we have one more. If not, we shall come back to our colleagues. So we'll start with Professor Springborg. You had a question from our colleague at PDO Oman on fiscal deficits and transformation. You know, how does this work together, hand in hand? Are we laggards or leaders? And I think it may be the former. So to preempt your answer.
Well, one argument is the one you implied. Singapore did not have resources; it had humans, and so necessity was the mother of invention for the Singaporeans. And we saw they diversified, and I guess the first was really refining and shipping. That's how it started, and it went from there. So you can argue that there is not that capital can be a hindrance to diversification. So I don't think there's any straight relationship between it. I mean, what you would like to think is it's a painless diversification. And the idea that suddenly we're going to start imposing real pain on people who've had entitlements in the past, and now they're going to be taxed, and taxed at a heavy rate to provide capital for private sector support through sovereign wealth funds or whatever it's going to be, I don't think it's on. So I do think there has to be a cushion period here, and I think this is the argument that is caught up in the Luciani book, that to make a shift from a rentier to a productive economy requires human sacrifice. And so you're going to have to ease that burden, or you're going to have political disruption. And so I think that's, so the Singapore model of necessity driving a very rapid transformation, which was the case in Singapore, is probably not on in this part of the world. So then the two have to be in balance. The fiscal and the diversification, a reasonable balance to succeed.
Thanks so much. Ali, you wanted to?
No, absolutely. And I think now we have in the region within the MENA exporters a region with two speeds. Those who are managing to manage their fiscal and public finances while proceeding relatively, not quickly, but relatively okay on the diversification front. And I would say this is a bit more Saudi, UAE, and then you have those that have big fiscal and external deficit challenges, and like Oman, since you are from Oman, and which I think is not moving as fast as others, or as what is needed. And that we can see it in the way the markets are pricing the risk, you see? So Oman, 5 years ago, spreads on its debt, or 3 years ago, were much tighter than it is today. And it was a bit close to Bahrain. Now it's exactly the opposite, even though Bahrain has much higher debt to GDP than Oman. So markets price perceptions of risk based on the policy intentions. So if the policy intention for reform is perceived to be slow or not delivering fast, then your risk premia would augment. And that is, for example, the case in the Omani. But frankly, I mean, I'm going to Oman on Monday, and I know that there's a lot of effort being done. Much of how you manage the risk premia is about how you communicate about your policies. Like in the case of Bahrain, a year and a half ago, Bahrain could not even tap the market. It tried and it failed. 1 year after it came back, or 6 months after it came back with a fiscal balance program, it went and it explains what it wanted to do with clear numbers, and it started implementing it, and the whole picture changed. So communicating about the reforms is extremely important. But even more important, just to underscore what my colleague said, is really about the internal consensus that we build about reform, so that this reform does not get reversed. So this brain power, I love it, because also I think this is our problem in Lebanon, is that we are not engaging stakeholders and internally in the economic decision making that is necessary and this is why the more you have a ownership domestically of the reform, the more you can project it externally and reduce your risk premia as perceived by markets.
Thank you, Alia.
And just on the elites and the migration, I cannot but agree with you.
Can you unpack it? Because you speak French as well. So.
I mean, I fully agree with you, because like, I mean, I see many, and Adel, many of us are from these educated labor that was exported from our countries, and I doubt that any Algerian or Egyptian or Saudi or Bahraini who sees the opportunity to serve their country at some point would not be able to leave everything and come and put their knowledge and the transfer of knowledge that sometimes countries pay for in order to get it from outside, not to put it internally. There are, I think, huge political economy constraints in many of the countries, state capture, elite capture, that often prevent the right allocation of resources, and particularly human capital, that I would think if they were employed in the right places, many of our countries would not be in the state in which they are now.
Thank you, Alia. And we'll end on ideas around opportunity and challenge. And I'm going to pick on Karen to start first and sort of wrap up in final comments. But while I think it was a grand tour d'horizon, I think these political economy challenges around competition, around state capture, around rent seeking, around oligopolies, and of course, the elephant in the room, which is the economic security nexus, which is the geopolitics. You know, I come from a region, Maghreb al-Arabi, where we're the least integrated region in the world in terms of trade volume. If OCP of Morocco and Sonatrach of Algeria were to come together, they'd be the largest fertilizer producer on the planet. And I'll take the liberty of also mentioning the Gulf crisis. The one block in the region where we saw some headwinds, a customs union, of course, politics got in the way. So I'd like to go to Karen, and I'd like around a minute each, or even less, just with, if you like, the one big thing that you think could really propel diversification and emancipation of the private sector, and the one challenge you see that's really holding things back.
Thanks, Adel. It's
and
nice
I'd also
that
like
so
to ask
many
our
more of you
colleagues
have joined
to
us.
maybe take some time and to perhaps show respect to our speakers while they conclude their remarks. Thank you.
That's fine. We've had a whole conversation really about, and we avoided the subject of the state in some ways. I mean, Alia brought it up a bit, and the state-led development models, but that's the thing that really has to change. And I think the Omani case is a really important one. Some things are out of your control. Debt repayments start in 2021. Things could be going on in the global economy. We could have a Chinese slowdown that will really affect a country like Oman, whose debt to GDP is like 65% or something. So those things are out of your control. What can you control inside? Military spending in Oman is completely unnecessary. It's very, very high, right? Why? So that money could be redirected to, to job creation, to schooling, to other things. And domestic politics, secession issues, clarity, communication about economic planning goes a long way. So the retrenchment of the state into all kinds of industries that it doesn't need to be in. We're seeing some signs of privatization within Oman and within the oil industry. That's excellent. So more of that. And I think the whole region could learn from that experience as well.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Sheikh Hind.
I can make it very brief and short. I would like to see more equality. That's what I want to see in Bahrain, Gulf states, Arab countries, equality.
Perfect. From economics to education, equity is king. No pun intended.
No, male, female equality.
And of course. Alia.
Oh, I mean, I think we came to the conclusion that a lot of effort is being made to direct the policies in the right place in order either to specialize in the kind of light, the energy sector that is needed and use the comparative advantage, but also try to strive beyond it by opening venues for new sectors. I think, I mean, sitting here in Rome and talking also to European stakeholders, which are an important partner for the region, both trade and investment partner. I think there is a joint interest, a strategic interest in making efforts of countries in MENA exporters to diversify in an orderly and successful manner is an interest, a strategic interest for Europe, as much as it is a strategic interest for the rest of the region. And we need to engage in partnership, whether in trade or aid or investment, along the lines of making these diversification strategies deliver on jobs and on reforms.
Thank you, Alia. Professor Springborg.
Well, just to underscore your point, we're here under the auspices of an organization that seeks to enhance dialogue to address what is essentially a civil war in the Middle East, North Africa region. And in the absence of cooling off that war and having dialogue to resolve some of the outstanding issues, it's not going to be Scandinavia. It is not going to be the Norwegian model, however much those in charge in the respective capitals would want it to be. DPW's decisions about where to invest in port facilities and so on is driven, as we just heard, as much by security concerns as it is by financial returns. And when you have that sort of a schizophrenic view of the investment of national resources, you double your problems. So I'll just underscore your point, and the point of the organizers of this conference, resolution of conflicts in the most conflict-prone region of the world, Middle East, North Africa, is absolutely essential.
Thank you. And last word to you, Ibrahim.
Well, I think education is the main pillar. Saudi Arabia, for example, we have less than over 50% of the population are under the age of 30. So education, unlocking the innovation for them, actually opening up these kind of entrepreneurship for them to open the diversification is a key component to the economy diversification.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. So glasnost, perestroika. It would take me hours to try and sum up, so I shall not intend to, and I shall save you from that. Before thanking our colleagues in the usual way, if you recall at the beginning of the panel, we had a survey. Now, as you can see, colleagues in the audience decided that the 3 top business risks for the MENA region are failure of economic reform agendas. We spoke about the visions. Tariffs and sanctions, think here Iran to Sudan. And of course, fiscal crises, the fiscal deficits continue. On that note, I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank you, the audience. And I'd like you to have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.